A pirate is hanged in 1730. 2 centuries later, people are still hunting for the treasure he supposedly left behind. But the one document that actually survives from his death says something much colder. No map, no treasure, no final riddle, just a sentence. Saint Paul on Bourbon Island, 7th of July, 1730. The judgment names Olivier Levasseur, called Buse, as a pirate. It records the sentence. It ends with the body, not with a code. The famous cryptogram belongs to another chain. That is the case here. Not whether a treasure was found, not whether a code can be solved. The question is smaller and more useful. What survives in the record, and what was built around the silence after Levasseur died? Some visual reconstructions in this episode are AI-assisted and based on historical records. The popular story is easy to tell. A condemned pirate stands on the scaffold. He throws a cryptogram into the crowd. He says the person who can read it may take his treasure. The record I can verify does not say that. The 1730 judgment says Levasseur was executed at Saint Paul. It does not record a thrown paper. It does not record last words. It does not record buried wealth. The official document closes the case as a legal act. The legend reopens it as a hunt. To understand why the hunt grew so large, start away from the scaffold. Start in the Indian Ocean, after the old Caribbean raiding world had begun to narrow. European companies had forts, agents, and patrols. Madagascar still offered distance. The Mascarenes, Mauritius, and Bourbon sat near the lanes that connected India, Arabia, East Africa, and Europe. Piracy, there was not a children's map with an X on it. It was a mobile economy that lived on gaps between empires. A ship could change names. A prize could be sold through an intermediary. A captured cargo could become a rumor before officials even agreed which court should hear the case. Levasseur entered that world before he entered the archive. Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates gives him an earlier career under the name Labouche. Johnson links him to the Indian Ocean pirate round and to the company of Edward England and John Taylor. That material matters, but it must be labeled. Johnson is not a court clerk. He is the author of a pirate book published for readers who wanted pirate stories. What the harder record shows about Levasseur before 1730 is narrower. He was a French sailor active in a corridor between Madagascar, the Mascarenes, and Indian Ocean trade lanes that European companies could neither close nor police. He moved through a maritime labor market in which a captain could be a privateer one year, a pirate the next, and a wanted man the year after that. By the late 1720s, the same companies that had once tolerated the gap were closing it. The stronger record comes later, when Levasseur is no longer only a name in a printed narrative. He becomes a defendant. By 1730, Bourbon was a French island under the authority of the Compagnie des Indes. The company wanted order in the sea lanes. It wanted commerce that could be taxed, defended, and reported. A pirate who had once been useful to rumor was not useful to administration. Levasseur was arrested and tried at Saint-Denis, then taken to Saint Paul for execution. The surviving judgment identifies him as Olivier Levasseur, called La Buse. It orders him hanged and strangled until death. That language is harsh because the law is harsh. It is also plain. It gives the charge, the sentence, and the place where the sentence would become public. This is the first split in the episode. On the left, the judgment. On the right, the later legend. The left column says, Saint Paul, 7th July 1730, execution for piracy. The right column says, cryptogram thrown from the scaffold, hidden treasure, a challenge to posterity. Only one side is visible in the 1730 record. Levasseur's reputation did not begin with the cryptogram. It began with a capture that was large enough to survive in several retellings. The Portuguese ship Nossa Senhora do Cabo, often rendered in English as Our Lady of the Cape. In 1721, pirates associated with Taylor and Levasseur took her near the Indian Ocean routes. Later accounts made the cargo immense. They named church plate, diamonds, gold, silver, and the personal goods of high-ranking Portuguese passengers. Here the record gets uneven. The capture of the Portuguese ship belongs to the pirate round's real history. The exact inventory has been repeated through later histories with different levels of confidence. The safest way to speak is this. The prize was famous in the record tradition because it was valuable, Catholic, Portuguese, and politically embarrassing. It gave later writers the one thing treasure legends need before they can grow: a source of wealth large enough to imagine. But a valuable prize is not the same thing as a buried hoard. A pirate crew that captures a rich ship has a problem of distribution, not romance. They need to divide cargo, sell portable goods, repair vessels, bribe, hide, move, and survive. Treasure that stays in one hole for a century is useful to a novelist. Money that moves is useful to a pirate. The Cape Prize explains why Levasseur could become attached to treasure. It does not prove that Levasseur left treasure behind. The records around his end are colder. They are administrative. A pirate is arrested. Officials process the case. The island authorities stage an execution. They do not write the scene that later readers want. No clerk writes, "He threw a paper." No witness writes, "He promised a fortune." No company report writes, "Search the island for the map." That absence should not be filled with imagination. It tells us where the record stops. The cryptogram enters the public story much later. In the 1930s, treasure hunting writing gave Buse a new afterlife. The name most often attached to that shift is Robert Charroux, who published the cryptogram as part of a treasure tradition. Charles de la Roncière also pushed the case into French public attention in 1934, presenting Buse as a mystery that could be pursued through archives, maritime history, and code. That decade matters. The 1930s were not 1730. They were a world of popular magazines, colonial nostalgia, museum curiosity, and treasure hunt publishing. A pirate who had died in a French colony could be remade into a puzzle. The island setting helped. The old execution helped. The Cape Prize helped. The archive helped most of all, because a real judgment made the legend feel as if it stood beside a real case. This is how source survival can feed legend accretion. One document survives. The survival gives the story a hard edge. Later writers attach a softer story to the edge and let readers mistake the whole shape for record. So the honest sequence is this. The execution record is contemporary. The cryptogram tradition is later. The treasure meaning is later still. Once you say that out loud, the mystery changes. The mystery is not that the cryptogram has never been solved. The mystery is why people trusted it in the first place. That is the midpoint of the case. Up to here, the question has been what the records actually preserve. After here, the question is why a document with weak provenance became more famous than a judgment with strong provenance. Look at the scaffold story as a scene. It gives the public everything the 1730 judgment withholds. It gives Levasseur a gesture. It gives him last words. It gives him control over the moment of death. It turns the condemned man into the author of the next chapter. The judgment does the opposite. It removes control from him. It names the authority. It names the punishment. It ends him. The scaffold cryptogram turns a state execution into a pirate's final performance. The judgment turns a pirate's career into a colonial legal file. One is built for repetition. The other is built for storage. St. Paul was not a stage in the romantic sense. It was a port town on Bourbon, a place where a public execution could carry a message to sailors, merchants, enslaved workers, colonial officials, and anyone else who heard what happened there. The island authorities did not need a mystery. They needed a warning. The company did not need Buse to become immortal. It needed him to become an example. In 1730, the case says, piracy will be processed, sentenced, and displayed. In the 1930s, the legend says, piracy left a secret the state never understood. Those are opposite stories built on the same source. The problem is not that later writers were interested in a code. Codes are interesting. The problem is that the code story often borrows authority from the execution record without giving any authority back. It stands near the archive and lets the viewer assume the archive contains more than it does. Johnson's role here is smaller than in many pirate cases, but still useful. His 1724 history helps explain how Buse entered Anglophone pirate memory before the execution. Johnson's version is an early printed layer of the pirate career. It is not the source for the cryptogram legend. It does not give us the scaffold throw. It belongs to an earlier myth layer, the career, the companions, the pirate round. The cryptogram legend is not Johnson's 1724 problem. It is a 20th century problem. That distinction stops us from making one big pile called legend. Pirate stories have layers. A claim from Johnson in 1724 has one kind of risk. A claim from a 1930s treasure book has another. A modern web page that says the treasure is still out there has a third. If the script treats all three as equally old, the viewer loses the one tool that makes historical thinking possible: sequence. First, an Indian Ocean pirate whose earlier career was printed in 1724. Then, a French colonial judgment in 1730. Then, a long afterlife in local memory and maritime writing. Then, in the 20th century, a cryptogram and a treasure hunt industry. If the cryptogram had been thrown from the scaffold in 1730, we would want an early witness, an official report, a colonial letter, a copy with provenance, or at least a near-contemporary mention. If the first strong public wave appears 2 centuries later, the burden changes. The story can still be studied. It cannot be promoted to the same shelf as the judgment. There is a temptation here to say that the cryptogram is worthless. That would be the wrong conclusion. The cryptogram is valuable as evidence of the legend's construction. It shows how Buse stopped being only a man executed for piracy and became a machine for producing searches. It shows how a colonial archive, a famous prize, and a code-like text can combine into a story strong enough to outlive its source problems. The cryptogram is not a key to a treasure chest. It is a key to a change in genre. Before it, Buse belongs mostly to piracy, colonial law, and Indian Ocean maritime violence. After it, he belongs to treasure hunting. That change has consequences. Treasure stories simplify the Indian Ocean. They turn trade routes, company courts, Portuguese imperial movement, Madagascar refuge networks, and Bourbon colonial authority into background scenery for one hidden object. The object becomes the point. The system disappears. But Levasseur's case is not a hidden object game. It is a record problem. What did colonial authority choose to preserve? A judgment. What did later audiences choose to preserve? A challenge. What did treasure writers need? A gap large enough to enter. The gap was there. The 1730 document does not tell us everything. It does not give the full trial transcript in the form a modern viewer would want. It does not narrate the arrest in cinematic detail. It does not inventory all claims about the Cape Prize. It does not close every route by which wealth could have moved. But a gap is not a map. The legend says Levasseur threw a cryptogram from the scaffold and offered his treasure to whoever could read it. The contemporary judgment says he was condemned and executed at St. Paul on 7 July 1730. The earlier source I can verify for the scaffold code tradition is not the 1730 record. It belongs to the later treasure hunting chain. The legend gives a final performance. The record gives a sentence. Once the execution is separated from the code, the title La Buse changes. It stops being the name of a pirate with an unsolved treasure and becomes the name of a case where the record and the later public wanted different things from the same death. The record wanted closure. The public wanted continuation. The scaffold story gives continuation. It lets Levasseur speak after the state kills him. It lets the audience believe the condemned man beat the court by moving the real case somewhere else, into a cipher, into a cave, into the hands of a future solver. That is a powerful story. It is also exactly the kind of story that needs a source trail. Without that trail, the most responsible version is not cynical. It is precise. Levasseur was real. His execution was real. The Cape Prize tradition was real enough to feed the later imagination. The cryptogram tradition is real as a later object of study and pursuit. The treasure it supposedly points to is not established by the contemporary record. In pirate history, certainty is often the costume legend wears after enough repetition. The job here is to take the costume off without pretending the person underneath is simple. Levasseur was not simple. The Indian Ocean pirate world was not simple. The French colonial court that killed him was not simple. But the scaffold cryptogram, as usually told, makes all of that smaller. It takes a legal death inside an imperial sea lane and turns it into one man's last puzzle. Buse did not become famous because the record proved a treasure. He became famous because the record left a hard death, and later writers found a way to make that death keep paying out. The judgment ended Olivier Levasseur's life. The cryptogram reopened his market. That is why the document matters. Not because it points to gold, but because it shows how little gold a legend needs once it has a real execution to stand beside.